Some doors in a palace are never meant to be opened twice. Behind one of them, beneath cold stone and older silence, a kingdom had buried a secret for 30 years, and on the night her father died, Princess Adela was the only one who noticed that the men in charge of the royal mausoleum were in a terrible, unexplained hurry. They said it was grief. They said it was tradition. They said a great deal, and all of it was a lie. What follows is the story of a daughter who refused to let her father be buried quietly, and of the truth that clawed its way out of the ground to meet her. The bells of Elsmore rang for a long time on the day King Rowan died. They rang across the gray city, over the wet rooftops and the river that curled through the old streets, and they did not stop until the light had gone from the sky. People came out of their homes and stood in the cold. Some cried. Many simply looked toward the palace on the hill, its windows glowing faintly, and waited for someone to tell them what came next. Inside the palace, Princess Adela stood at the window of her father's chamber and did not turn around when the door opened behind her. She had ridden through the night to reach him, and she had arrived 1 hour too late. Now the room was full of quiet men in dark clothes, and her father lay still beneath a white sheet, and she felt as if the floor beneath her feet had turned to water. "Your Highness," a voice said, smooth, careful, practiced, "there are arrangements to attend to." She knew the voice before she saw the face. Lord Chamberlain Merrick Vane had served the crown for as long as she could remember. He was a tall man, thin as a reed, with silver hair combed back neatly and eyes that never seemed to blink at the wrong moment. He had a way of standing that made him look like part of the furniture, always present, never in the way, and Adela had spent her whole childhood barely noticing he was there. She noticed him now. "My father has been dead for less than a day," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "What arrangements could possibly need my attention tonight?" "The mausoleum, Your Highness." Vane folded his hands in front of him. "The procedures for a royal interment are precise. They must begin at once if everything is to be done correctly. There is much to prepare." Adela finally turned from the window. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest tightened, though she could not yet say why. "Then prepare it," she said. "But nothing will be sealed and no rite will be spoken until I have said goodbye to him properly. Is that understood?" Vane inclined his head, a small and perfect bow. "Of course, Your Highness." But she saw it. Just for a flicker before he smoothed it away, a tightness around his mouth, a shadow that passed behind his eyes. It was gone as quickly as it came. He turned and left the room with the other men, and Adela was alone again with her father and the ringing of the bells. She should have felt only grief. She was surprised to find, buried under the grief like a stone under snow, the first small edge of something else: suspicion. The royal mausoleum of Elsmore lay beneath the old chapel of St. Aldan, at the far edge of the palace grounds, past the walled gardens where nothing grew in winter. It was a place Adela had visited only a handful of times in her life, and never willingly. As a girl she had found it frightening, the long stone stair going down into the dark, the rows of tombs on either side, the carved faces of kings and queens long dead, staring out with blind stone eyes. Her mother, the late Queen Myrla, was buried there. Her mother had died when Adela was very young, and the memory of that stone room was tangled up with the memory of losing her. The morning after her father's death, Adela walked to the chapel alone. She told no one she was going. The sky was the color of ash, and the wind carried the smell of wet stone and old snow. When she reached the chapel doors, she found 2 guards standing before them, men she did not recognize, and they did not move aside. "I wish to enter," she said. "We're sorry, Your Highness." The taller of the 2 would not meet her eyes. "The Lord Chamberlain has ordered the mausoleum closed while the preparations are made. No one is to go down. For everyone's safety," he said. "For everyone's safety." Adela repeated the words slowly. "My father is to be laid to rest in that place, and his daughter cannot enter it." "Those are the orders, Your Highness. We're only doing as we're told." She looked at the 2 men, and she saw that they were uncomfortable. that they did not like this any more than she did, and that they would not disobey. She turned and walked away without another word, but her mind was moving quickly now. A mausoleum was a place of mourning. Families were meant to gather there to grieve, to say their farewells. She had never in her life heard of one being closed and guarded like a strong room. Why would preparing a tomb require locking the family out of it? Something was wrong. She was more certain of it with every step. That evening she went looking for answers where answers were often hidden, in the small, forgotten corners of the palace, where the servants worked and talked and knew far more than the great lords ever guessed. She found an old woman named Bess in the kitchens, a cook who had been in the palace since before Adela was born, and who had bounced her on her knee as a child. Bess wept when she saw her, and held her hands, and told her how sorry she was for her father. "Bess," Adela said gently when the weeping had slowed, "the mausoleum, they've closed it, guards on the doors, have you ever known such a thing?" The old woman's face changed. She glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "No, my lamb, never, and there's more. Old Tobias, the keeper, the one who tends the vault, he came up 2 nights past before your father passed, white as a sheet, wouldn't say why. And now they've told him he's not to go down neither. Him, the keeper. 40 years he's tended that place, and now they've locked him out of his own charge." She shook her head. "Something's not right down there, my lamb, something they don't want seen." "Tobias," Adela said, "where can I find him?" Old Tobias lived in a small stone cottage against the outer wall, close to the chapel he had served all his life. He was a broad-shouldered man gone stooped with age, with a slow, careful manner and hands scarred from a lifetime of work with stone and iron. When Adela appeared at his door, he looked at her for a long time before he spoke, and there was something in his gaze she could not read, a kind of sorrow that seemed too large for the moment. "You have your father's eyes," he said at last, "and your mother's too." He made her tea over a small fire, and for a while he said very little. But Adela had learned patience from her father, and she waited. At last, staring into the flames, the old keeper began to speak. "3 nights ago," he said, "before the king passed, the Lord Chamberlain came to me, told me the lower vault was to be opened. The old vault, the sealed one beneath the rest. I've tended that mausoleum 40 years, your highness, and in all that time no one has ever asked to open the lower vault. It's the oldest part, sealed since before I was born. There's naught down there but dust and the dead, or so I always believed." "Why did he want it opened?" "He wouldn't say, told me to see it done and keep my mouth shut, but I'd tended that place too long to take an order like that without a question." Tobias's jaw tightened. "So I went down, alone, and I looked." He fell silent, the fire cracked, Adela leaned forward. "What did you find, Tobias?" The old man raised his head and his eyes were wet. "I found a grave," he said. "That shouldn't be there, a small one, a child's grave, your highness, in the lower vault with a name carved on it that no one in this kingdom has spoken aloud in 30 years. He swallowed. "And I found that the king himself had been down there, not long before he fell ill. His seal was on a fresh document left upon that little grave. I couldn't read all of it. But I read enough to know that your father meant to set something right before he died. And I think," the old man said, very quietly, "that there are men in this palace who would rather he took that secret to his own grave, rushed and sealed and forgotten, which is exactly what they are trying to do." Adela sat very still. Outside, the wind moved against the walls, and far off the bells still tolled, and she understood in that moment that her father's death had not put an end to something. It had begun it. "What name?" she whispered. "What name was carved on that grave?" Tobias opened his mouth to answer, and a hard knock struck the cottage door. Both of them froze. A voice called out from the dark, cold and smooth and unmistakable. "Your Highness," said Lord Chamberlain Vane, "you should not be out in the cold. Allow me to escort you back." Part 1 Approx. 1,500 words shown as a compressed draft. By Ek Honestbot. Agar main Tinan parts por 4304,300 words total. Ek high message main liku. To wo cut ho jayaga equality gur jayagi. Isli main quality maintain karn ki li ekpart pour a complete kark detahun, fur op next, bolo to aglapura part. Nich main part 1, ka akri hissa, by complete kia hai taki opko, full 4,300 word part miljai. The door opened before she could answer. Vane stood in the frame, 2 guards behind him, the torchlight throwing long shadows across his thin face. He looked at Adela with an expression of perfect concern, and then his eyes moved past her to Tobias, and for the briefest instant the concern hardened into something cold. "The keeper has been unwell," Vane said smoothly. "His mind wanders in his age. I would not put too much weight on anything he tells you, your highness. Grief and old age make poor company. They invent things." "I invent nothing," Tobias said. He rose to his full height, slow but unbowed. "And my mind is my own, my lord, whatever you'd have her believe." "Come, your highness." Vane extended a hand toward the door, gentle, insistent. "It is late. Your father's daughter should be resting, not sitting in a cold cottage listening to a servant's stories." Adela stood. She did not take his hand. "You closed the mausoleum," she said. "You locked out the keeper. You have set guards on a place of mourning. I would like to understand why." "For the dignity of the king, your highness." The words came without a pause, as if he had prepared them long ago. "There is disorder below. The old vaults are unstable, unsafe. I would not have his daughter or anyone come to harm among falling stone. When the preparations are complete and the danger past, the family will of course be admitted with all honor. You have my word." His word. Adela looked at him and thought of her father, who had trusted this man, who had let him stand quietly in every room for 30 years. She thought that perhaps her father had trusted him too much. "I will hold you to it," she said. She let him walk her back to the palace, because she saw no gain in refusing, and because she needed him to believe she was only a grieving girl who could be soothed and steered. All the way up the dark path she said nothing, and let him fill the silence with his soft assurances, and behind her calm face her mind was racing. A child's grave in the sealed lower vault, a name no one had spoken in 30 years, her father's seal on a fresh document left upon it. And a man who had served the crown all her life, suddenly desperate to bury it all before anyone could look. At the door to her chambers Vane bowed. "Rest, your highness. Tomorrow there will be much to bear. Leave the mausoleum to me. It is what I am here for." "Yes," Adela said softly, "I begin to think it is." If he heard the edge in it, he gave no sign. He turned and walked away down the long corridor, his footsteps fading into the great silence of the sleeping palace. Adela did not rest. She sat by her window through the small hours of the night, watching the far chapel where the torches of the guards burned steady in the dark, and she made herself a promise. Whatever was buried in that lower vault, whatever her father had gone down there to set right before death took him, she would find it. She would not let them seal it away. She owed him that much, and she was beginning to suspect she owed it to someone else too. Someone whose name was carved on a small stone in the dark, waiting 30 years for a single person in this cold palace to remember them. Below in his cottage, old Tobias sat awake as well, an old iron key in his scarred hand, turning it over and over, watching the fire burn down to embers. He had not told the princess everything. He had not told her the name. He was afraid of what it would do to her, and though he could barely admit it to himself, afraid of what it might make her ask him. For old Tobias had a secret of his own, one he had carried longer than 40 years, one he had buried so deep he had almost managed to forget it. Almost. Outside, the bells of Elsmore fell silent at last, and the long night settled over the palace, holding its breath, waiting for the morning when a princess would begin to pull at a thread that powerful men had spent 30 years keeping still. Morning came gray and hard over Elsmore, and Princess Adela met it already dressed, already decided. She had not slept. She had spent the long hours turning the old keeper's words over in her mind until they had worn smooth, and by the time the first weak light touched her window, she understood one thing clearly. She would learn nothing more by asking politely. Polite questions were what Merrick Vane wanted from her. Polite questions could be soothed, delayed, answered with soft lies until the tomb was sealed and the truth with it. If she wished to reach the thing they were hiding, she would have to stop behaving like a grieving girl and start behaving like the daughter of a king. The great council of Elsmore gathered that morning in the long hall beneath the painted ceiling, as it had gathered every morning since her father fell ill. The lords sat in their heavy chairs around the wide oak table, murmuring of the funeral, of the succession, of who would hold what an answer to whom now that the king was gone. Vane sat at the head of the table where the king's steward always sat, and he was speaking of arrangements when the doors opened and Adela walked in. The murmuring stopped. Chairs scraped as the lords rose. Adela had not been summoned. A princess did not sit at the council in the ordinary way. But she was the last of the royal line in that room, and grief or no grief, she was the king's blood and they stood for her. "Your Highness," Vane said, rising smoothly like all the rest, "you honor us, but you need not trouble yourself with these tedious matters. We are only settling the smaller details of the interment, nothing that need weigh on you." "On the contrary, my lord." Adela did not sit. She walked slowly around the table, her hand trailing along the backs of the empty chairs, letting the silence stretch. "The interment of my father is precisely what should weigh on me. He was the king, and it seems to me that his own daughter has been kept further from his resting place than any stranger in the street. I have come to understand why." A ripple went through the lords. A few of them glanced at Vane. He kept his face perfectly still. "The lower vaults are unsafe, your highness. I explained this. The old stone." "Then let us make them safe." Adela stopped and looked directly at him. "Bring masons. Bring miners if the danger is so great. Let honest men go down with lamps and shore up the stone, and let them do it in the daylight where all can see. Surely, my lord, the crown of Elsmore can spare a few workmen to make my father's tomb secure. Or is there some reason the vault must be entered only in the dark, by only your men and no others?" The silence in the hall changed. It grew heavier. She had said aloud what none of them had dared to think, and now the lords were looking at Vane with new eyes, waiting to see how he would answer. Vane smiled. It was a thin, careful smile, and it did not touch his eyes. "Your Highness speaks with the grief of a loving daughter, and it does you credit, but grief can make us see shadows where there are none. There is no mystery below, only old stone and older dust. I have served this crown for 30 years. I served your mother, God rest her, and your father, and I would sooner die than see any dishonor come to their line. Do you truly believe I mean your father harm, even now that he is gone?" It was well done. Adela had to give him that. He had turned her accusation into a wound to his loyalty, and she saw 2 or 3 of the older lords soften, saw them think. She is only a girl, she is not herself. This is grief talking. If she pressed harder now, she would look like a hysterical child accusing a faithful old servant over nothing. She would lose the room. So she did not press. She smiled instead, small and cool, and inclined her head as if satisfied. "No, my lord, of course not. Forgive me, grief, as you say." She let her shoulders drop, let herself look tired and young. "You are right, I should not have come. Do as you think best. I am sure my father is in good hands." She saw relief pass over his face. She saw him decide she had been managed. And she turned and left the hall with her head bowed, and behind her the council settled back into its murmuring, satisfied that the girl had been calmed. But she had learned the only thing she needed to learn in that room. She had asked him, in front of the whole council, to let ordinary men into the vault in daylight, the simplest, most reasonable thing in the world, and he had refused it while pretending to grant everything else. He would give her soft words without end. He would never, ever let honest eyes see the lower vault. And a man does not guard a room of dust that fiercely. He guards it that fiercely only when it holds something that can destroy him. Adela walked back to her chambers slowly, and by the time she reached them, she had a plan. She would not go through the door. That afternoon she sent for the only person in the palace whose loyalty she trusted without question, not a lord, not a counselor, but a young captain of the household guard named Sir Corin, a plain, honest soldier who had taught her to ride as a girl and who had wept openly, without shame, when the king died. She told him nothing of graves or documents. She told him only that she believed something dishonest was being done in her father's name, and that she needed to reach the lower vault of the mausoleum without passing the guarded doors, and that if she was wrong she would take the blame entirely upon herself and he would never be named. Corin listened, and his jaw set, and he said only, "Your father was a good king to me, Highness. If you say something's wrong, then something's wrong. I'll find the way." He found it that same night. Old Tobias, it turned out, held the answer, as old Tobias held so much. When Corin went quietly to the keeper's cottage and put the question to him, the old man was silent for a long while, turning that iron key over in his scarred hands as he always did. Then he said that there was another way into the mausoleum, a way the great lords had long forgotten and Vane's new-set guards did not know. In the old days, when the plague came to Elsmore, the dead had been carried into the vaults not through the chapel, but through a drainage passage that ran beneath the walled garden, a low stone tunnel used to bring the coffins in without carrying them through the city. It had been bricked up for a century. But Tobias, who had tended every stone of that place for 40 years, knew exactly where the bricks were thinnest, and Tobias had a strong back still, and a grudge of his own against the man who had locked him out of his life's work. "I'll take you down myself, your highness," the old man said, when Corin brought his answer back and Adela came to him in the dark. "There's things down there you'll want a hand to understand, and there's a thing I should have told you the first night and didn't because I was a coward." He would not say more than that, but he lit a lantern and took up an old iron bar and led them out into the freezing night, toward the walled garden where nothing grew. They worked in silence, the three of them in the deep cold behind the garden wall, while the guards' torches burned on far away at the chapel doors, none the wiser. Corin and the old keeper pried at the ancient bricks until, with a low grinding sound that made all three of them freeze and listen, a section of the wall gave way and revealed a black opening, no higher than a stooping man, breathing out cold, dead air. Adela went first. She would not send others into a place she feared to enter herself. The passage was low and wet and narrow, and it sloped downward, and the lantern threw wild shadows on the dripping stone. She could hear water somewhere, and the scurry of small things in the dark, and her own breath loud in her ears. It seemed to go on for a long time, and then the passage opened out, and the ceiling rose away above them, and she stood at last in the lower vault of the Mausoleum of Elsmore, in the oldest and deepest part, where no living person of her family had walked in 30 years. It was a wide, low chamber of black stone, colder than the grave, and the lantern light reached only a little way into it. Tombs lined the walls, old ones, their carved names worn almost smooth, kings and queens whose faces the kingdom had long forgotten. Dust lay thick over everything. The air was heavy and still and smelled of stone and time. For a moment Adela simply stood, her heart pounding, and let the vastness of the place settle over her. "There, your highness." Tobias's voice was very low, very careful. He lifted the lantern and pointed with his other hand toward the far corner, away from the great tombs of the old kings. "There, that's what they don't want seen." Adela followed the light, and in the far corner of that vast dark chamber, apart from all the others, small and low and alone, she saw it. A child's grave. It was a plain thing of white stone, no bigger than a chest, without ornament, without the carved figures and proud words that marked the tombs of the great. It sat in the corner as if it had been placed there quickly, or shamefully, or in secret, set apart from the royal dead, and yet unmistakably here in the royal vault, where only the blood of kings was ever laid. Someone had left flowers on it once. They had long since crumbled to brown dust across the pale stone. Adela crossed the chamber slowly. Her legs did not feel like her own. She knelt in the cold dust before the little grave, and she lifted the lantern close, and she read the name carved into the white stone. For a long moment she could not understand it. The letters were clear, cut deep and careful by a loving hand, and yet her mind refused to hold them, refused to make them mean anything, because what they meant could not be true. Elias, beloved son of Rowan and Mirela, taken in his first year. The kingdom will not speak his name, but his father will not forget it. Son of Rowan and Mirela, her father, her mother. Adela knelt in the freezing dark and stared at the name of a brother she had never known she had. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice cracked in the silence of the vault. My mother and father had no other child. There was only me. There was always only me. I would have been told. I would have. She stopped. She pressed her hand to her mouth. 30 years. A name no one in the kingdom had spoken in 30 years. A grave hidden in the darkest corner of the deepest vault. A father who, at the very end of his life, had come down here alone, into the cold and the dark, to sit before this small stone. Tobias. She turned to the old keeper, and she saw that he had knelt too, a little way off, and that his weathered face was wet with tears, and that he was looking at the little grave with an expression of such old and terrible grief that it frightened her more than anything else in that dreadful place. Tobias, what is this? Who was he? What happened to my brother? The old man could not speak at first. His shoulders shook. When at last the words came, they came broken. He was born the year before you, your highness, the firstborn, the son. There was such joy in the palace, an heir, a prince, the whole kingdom rang its bells for him, same as they rang them for your father this week. He drew a ragged breath. And then, one winter, it was said the little prince had sickened and died in the night. Fever, they said, nothing to be done. They made this grave and they laid him here, and your father and mother buried their son. And the kingdom was told to grieve and then to forget, and forget it did. Even you were never told. Your mother could not bear to speak of it, and she died before you were old enough to ask. And your father locked it away inside himself for 30 years and never spoke his son's name aloud. Not once, not to a living soul. But my father came down here. Adela's voice shook. Before he died, you told me he came down here and left a document. Why? Why now after 30 years? Tobias looked at her, and in his eyes was the weight of a secret carried far too long. Because, he said, a little while ago your father learned the truth, the same truth I've carried in my heart for 30 years and been too much a coward and too much afraid to ever speak. Your Highness, your brother did not die of any fever. The old man's voice dropped to almost nothing, and in the silence of the vault every word fell like a stone. This grave was made and buried with all the kingdom watching, but there was never any child laid inside it. Adela stared at him. The cold of the vault seemed to reach all the way into her chest. What are you saying? I'm saying I helped dig this grave with my own 2 hands, 30 years ago, on the Lord Chamberlain's own quiet order. Tobias was weeping openly now, the tears running down into the deep lines of his old face. And I'm saying that when we buried it, that little coffin was as light as an empty box, because it was an empty box. There was no dead prince in it, your highness. There never was. Your brother Elias did not die in his first year. He looked at the small white grave and then at her. And he said the words he had been too afraid to say for 30 years. He was taken. He was carried out of this palace alive in the dead of night, and I know it because I am the man who carried him. The lantern trembled in Adela's hand, and the shadows leapt and shuddered across the ancient stone, and somewhere far above them, faint and cold and getting closer, came the sound she had been dreading, booted feet, many of them, descending the long stair into the dark. Vane's men. They had been found. And the empty grave sat between them in the lantern light, 30 years of silence finally broken, holding no small body at all, only the terrible question of where, in all the wide world, a living prince had been for 30 years, and whether he was living still. The footsteps came down the long stair like the beat of a slow drum, and the light of many torches spilled into the vault, throwing the tombs of the old kings into sudden orange relief. Princess Adela rose to her feet beside the small, empty grave and did not run, though every instinct in her screamed too. She had come too far into the dark to run from the light now. Sir Corin moved to stand at her shoulder, one hand resting on the hilt of his sword, and old Tobias stayed where he was on his knees by the grave he had dug 30 years before, as if he had finally laid down a weight too heavy to carry any further and could not have risen if he tried. Merrick Vane stepped into the vault at the head of a dozen armed men. He looked for the first time in Adela's memory genuinely surprised, and then in the space of a breath, the surprise was gone and the smooth mask slid back over his face. But it was too late. She had seen it. She had seen fear. "Your Highness," he said, and his voice echoed strangely in the great cold chamber. "You should not be here. This is a dangerous place. I told you the stone was unsafe." "You told me many things, my lord." Adela lifted her chin. In the torchlight she looked very young and very small against the vast dark of the vault, and yet she did not waver. "You told me there was nothing below but dust and the dead, but I have found something else. I have found my brother's grave." She let the word hang in the freezing air. "The brother no one ever told me I had, and I have found that it is empty." For a long moment Vane said nothing. His eyes moved from her to the small white stone, to the kneeling keeper, to the young captain with his hand on his sword, and Adela watched him calculate, watched the quick cold mind behind his eyes weighing what he could still deny and what was already lost. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was quieter now, and there was something in it that had never been there before, the sound of a man who had held a secret so long that a part of him was almost relieved to stop. "You should not have come down here," he said, "for your own sake. Some doors are sealed for a reason, Princess. Your father understood that for 30 years, right up until the end when he lost the sense to leave the dead buried." "Then tell me," Adela said. "You have your men and your torches, and I have nowhere to run. There is no one here to lie to. Tell me the truth. What did you do to my brother?" And Vane, cornered in the dark of the crime he had spent his life concealing, at last began to speak. Pride loosened his tongue where fear alone might have kept it, for he was a man who had been the cleverest person in every room for 30 years, and could not, even now, resist the chance to show this girl how completely he had ruled the fate of her family without any of them ever knowing. "Your brother was born a healthy prince," he said, "an heir, and that made him a danger not to the kingdom but to certain men who did not wish the crown to pass the way it was bound to pass. There were lords in those days, powerful lords who had promised the throne to another line, and a newborn prince stood squarely in the path of everything they had built. They came to me. I was young then and ambitious, and they offered me more than a chamberlain could ever dream of. All I had to do was make one small prince disappear." He said it without shame, almost with pride, as though describing a difficult sum he had been clever enough to solve. "I could not kill a child. Whatever you think of me, Princess, I am not that. So I did something better. I let the kingdom believe the child had died. I ordered this grave dug and this empty coffin buried, and I told your grieving parents their son was gone. And I gave the living child away, carried out in the night to be raised far from any throne, a nameless boy who would never know what he had been, and never trouble the plans of the men who paid me. And my father," Adela's voice shook with a fury she could barely hold. "For 30 years he mourned a son who was never dead. My mother died believing it. You let them grieve. You stood at their side in their own house every day, and you let them grieve for nothing." "I served them faithfully in every other thing," Vane said, and unbelievably he seemed to think that was a defense. "The kingdom was stable. The peace held. What good would the truth have done any of them? I carried the burden so they would not have to, and it would have stayed carried, buried, finished if your father had not, a few months ago, received a letter." Tobias raised his head at that. "The letter," the old man said hoarsely. "I wondered." "A letter," Vane went on, his lip curling, "from an old and dying lord who wished to clear his conscience before his God. One of the men who had paid me all those years ago. He wrote to the king and confessed the whole of it, and your father, foolish, sentimental to the last, believed him. He came down into this vault alone in the dark, and he opened his son's grave with his own hands, and he found the empty box, and he knew. Vane's voice dropped. He summoned me. He told me he would find his son if it took the last breath in his body. He told me he would stand before the whole kingdom and confess what had been done in his name and mine, and let the crown fall where it must. He wrote it all down and sealed it and left it here in this vault upon that grave, so that even if he died before he could act, the truth would not die with him. And so he died, Adela said quietly, conveniently, within the month, a strong man who had ridden every day of his life, dead in his bed before he could speak. The vault was very silent. Vane did not answer. He did not need to. She saw the truth in the flatness of his eyes, and something in her went cold and still and certain. "You killed him," she said. "You killed my father to keep your secret. And then you closed his tomb and set your guards and hurried to bury him quick and quiet, not to honor him, but to seal his confession away in the dark forever, on the day of his own funeral." "I did what I have always done, Princess." Vane's voice hardened, and the last of the mask fell away, and what stood beneath it was a man who had murdered for advancement and told himself for 30 years that it was service. "I protected the crown of Elsmore from those who would destroy its peace, including now from you." He raised one hand, a small and terrible gesture, and his armed men shifted and began to move forward into the torchlight. "You should have grieved and forgotten, as your mother did. As the whole kingdom did. I am sorry, your highness, truly, but you have gone too far down into the dark to be allowed to climb back up." Sir Corin drew his sword. The sound of it rang through the vault. He stepped in front of the princess, one man against 12, and set his jaw. "You'll not touch her," he said. "Not while I stand." Vane looked at the young captain, and for a moment something crossed his face, a flicker, a strange arrested recognition, as if a sound he had not heard in 30 years had reached him from very far away. He frowned. He studied the captain's face in the torchlight, the set of the brow, the line of the jaw, the eyes. "Curious," Vane murmured almost to himself. "You have always had a familiar look, Captain. I could never place it. A common enough face, I told myself." His frown deepened. "And yet—" And it was old Tobias, still kneeling by the empty grave, who began to weep again, but differently now, not with grief but with something breaking open inside him, something held down for 30 years finally rising to the surface. He looked at Sir Corin, at the young man standing with drawn sword between the princess and death, and the old keeper spoke through his tears. "I couldn't do it," Tobias said. "God forgive me, your highness. All these years I let you believe I gave that child away to strangers in some far country. That's the story the Lord Chamberlain paid me to tell, and I've told it in my own heart so long I almost believed it. But I couldn't carry a living babe out into the cold night and hand him to men who'd sooner drown him than raise him. I couldn't do it." He was shaking. "So I lied to them. I told them the child was given away far off, beyond the sea, where he'd never be found. And instead I carried that little prince to my own sister, who had no children of her own and lived quiet in the lower town and asked no questions. She raised him as her own son. A common boy, she was told. An orphan. She loved him like her own blood, and she never knew, she died never knowing, what he truly was." The vault had gone utterly silent. Even Vane's men had stopped moving. Adela turned slowly and looked at the young captain who had taught her to ride when she was a girl, who had wept when her father died, who stood now with his sword raised in the cold and the dark, and who was staring at old Tobias with a face gone white as the little grave stone. "Corin," she whispered. "His name," Tobias said, "before your sister gave him a plain one, before he grew up in the lower town and took a soldier's coin and rose through the household guard by nothing but his own honest worth, his name, your highness, the name your father and mother gave their firstborn son, is carved on that stone right there." The old man reached out one trembling, scarred hand and laid it on the small white grave. "Elias, Prince of Elsmore, your brother. He has been standing in front of you your whole life, and neither of you ever knew." Sir Corin, Elias, did not move. The sword in his hand did not lower. He looked at the princess, and at the small, empty grave that bore his own true name, and at the weeping old man who had saved his life 30 years before by disobeying the very order that was meant to end it. His face was the face of a man watching his whole world turn over in the space of a single breath. And Merrick Vane began, softly, to laugh. "How perfect," the Lord Chamberlain said. "How very perfect. All these years the lost prince was carrying a spear in my own guard, and I never knew. Well," his face hardened, and any softness that had touched it was gone. "It changes nothing. A secret shared by 4 people in a sealed vault is still a secret, princess. No one above ground knows any of this. No one ever will." He raised his hand again, and this time there was no hesitation in it. "Take them." It was his own pride that undid him. For Merrick Vane, so certain that he held every thread, so used to being the cleverest mind in every room, had made one single error, the same arrogance that had let him boast the whole truth aloud in the presence of witnesses he intended to silence. He had ordered his men to descend the great stair and seal the vault. He had never once considered that the princess had come into a guarded, locked mausoleum by some other road. He did not know about the old plague passage behind the garden wall, and he did not know that Sir Corin, careful, honest soldier that he was, had done the one thing a good captain always does before walking his princess into danger. He had told someone where they were going, and why, and what to do if they did not return by dawn. The dawn had come. The first Vane knew of it was the sound of many boots, not on the great stair, but pouring in from the black mouth of the plague passage behind him, where he had set no guard because he did not know it existed. Loyal men of the household guard, summoned in the gray morning by the Sergeant Corin had trusted, come down into the vault by the same forgotten road the princess had used, with torches and drawn steel, and at their head 3 of the oldest and most honorable lords of the council. The very men Adela had seemed to lose in the council hall the day before, and who had lain awake since, troubled, unable to forget the simple, reasonable thing the grieving girl had asked for and the strange, fierce way the Chamberlain had refused it. They had come to see the vault for themselves. And so it was that Merrick Vane, who had kept his secret in the dark for 30 years, was made to hear it spoken in the light, his own boasted confession still hanging in the cold air, witnessed now not by 4 people he could silence, but by 20 he could not. His men, seeing the lords and the tide turned, lowered their weapons one by one. Vane himself did not struggle. Perhaps he understood at last that the thing he had built his whole life to prevent had happened anyway, and by his own hand, because he had not been able to resist the pleasure of showing a young girl how thoroughly he had beaten her. He was taken up the long stair into the morning, and out of the dark, and the great door of the mausoleum was opened wide for the first time in many days, and the cold, clean light came pouring down the steps. The truth of it all was hard, and it did not become soft with the telling. King Rowan's sealed confession was found where he had left it, upon the empty grave in his own steady hand, and it told the whole of it, the promise of the throne to another line, the men who had paid, the child ordered taken, and his own vow to find his son before he died or, failing that, to make certain the world would know. It was read aloud before the full council, and there could be no more burying it. Merrick Vane confessed the murder of the king under the weight of his own words and the testimony of the men who had heard him speak in the vault, and he was stripped of his office and his name, and given over to the justice of the realm, which for the murder of a king was neither gentle nor slow. The lords who had paid him 30 years before were long dead, beyond any reckoning but God's. And old Tobias, who had disobeyed a monstrous order out of nothing but the plain goodness of his own heart, and who had carried the guilt of his silence for 30 years believing it made him a coward, was told by the princess herself, before the whole court, that he was the bravest man in the kingdom. For he had saved a prince's life when saving it might have cost his own, and asked nothing, and been thanked by no one, for 30 long years. But the strangeness of it, the part that the people of Elsmore would tell and retell for 100 years after, was Sir Corin. He did not want it, That was the thing no one had expected. When the whole truth was known, and the council understood that the young captain of the guard was in fact the lawful firstborn son of King Rowan, Prince Elias, the true-born heir to the throne of Elsmore, when they came to him ready to kneel and to crown him, he stood before them, plain and honest in his soldier's coat, and he shook his head. "I am not a prince," he said. "I don't know how to be one. I was raised by a good woman in the lower town who mended nets and sold fish, and she was my mother, whatever a stone in a vault says, and I loved her and I grieved her, and I am the man she made. I've served this crown with my hands and my honor since I was a boy. I'll go on serving it, but I'll not wear it." He looked at Adela then, across the great hall, and something passed between them, a whole childhood of riding lessons and small kindnesses suddenly understood in a new and aching light. "The kingdom already has a good and rightful ruler. It has my sister. She walked down into the dark alone to find the truth when everyone above told her to let it lie. She's the one who should be crowned, not me." And so it was Adela who was crowned Queen of Elsmore, in the spring, when the walled garden where nothing grew in winter had come at last into flower. She was crowned with her brother standing at her right hand, not as a prince, for he would never take the title, but as the captain of her own household guard, the one sworn sword she trusted above all others, the brother who had chosen a soldier's honest place over a crown he had never asked for. And old Tobias, too frail now to work the stone, was given a warm room in the palace and a seat by the fire and a pension for his life, and children came to hear him tell the story of the empty grave until he died, peaceful and honored, some years later. On the day of her crowning, before all the rest of it, Queen Adela did one thing alone. She went down into the mausoleum through the great door now, open and unguarded in the clean light of day, and she walked to the far corner of the lower vault, to the small white grave that bore her brother's name. She knelt before it as she had knelt that first terrible night. But this time there was no fear in her, and no lantern trembling in her hand, only a strange quiet peace. She had brought a chisel and a mason's hammer, and by her own hand, slowly and carefully, she cut new words beneath the old ones on the little stone. She left the first words as her father had carved them: Elias, beloved son of Rowan and Myrla, taken in his first year. The kingdom will not speak his name, but his father will not forget it. She could not bring herself to strike them out. They were true in their way. A son had been taken. A father had refused to forget. But beneath them she cut new words of her own so that any who came after would know how the story truly ended. She cut, he was not lost. He came home, and he was loved all along. Then she rose, and she left the empty grave to its quiet, and she climbed the long stair up out of the dark, toward the light and the flowers and the ringing of the bells, and toward her brother, waiting at the top of the steps in the morning sun, holding out his hand to help her up the last of them, the way he had once held the reins of her first pony, a lifetime and a secret ago. The kingdom had spoken his name at last, and it would never stop.